My name is Marlo Ashcombe. I was 27 when my family stood in the doorway of my 400-square-foot apartment and decided, without asking me a single question, that my life had failed. It was a Sunday. I remember that because Sundays in my family meant obligation, dressed up as love, a rotating brunch, always at someone's house, always narrated by my mother in a voice that made every gathering sound like a performance she was reviewing. That week it was my turn for the first time in 3 years because I had finally moved somewhere close enough to host. I'd spent 2 days cleaning a space that didn't need much cleaning. There isn't much square footage for dust to hide in. I'd folded the Murphy bed into the wall, wiped down the single window that looked out over a narrow alley, and, if you leaned right, a sliver of the river 2 blocks over. I'd bought flowers. Cheap ones from the corner stand because I liked the color more than the price tag ever bothered me. My mother arrived first, as always, my father trailing behind her with the particular tiredness of a man who had learned decades ago that his opinions were optional in this family. My sister Dahlia came last, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, even though it was overcast, scrolling through her phone as she climbed the 2 flights of stairs because the building had no elevator. I opened the door, already smiling.
I want to be honest about that.
I was proud. Not of the size. I'd stopped measuring my life in square feet a long time ago, but of what the size represented. Every choice in that room had been mine. The bookshelf built from reclaimed wood I'd sanded myself on weekends. The drafting table in the corner, permanently angled toward the light. The particular quiet of a space where no one owned any part of me. My mother stepped inside and stopped 3 feet past the threshold, because 3 feet past the threshold was already most of the way across the room.
"Oh," she said. "Just that. Oh."
The kind of oh that does more work than a full sentence. "This is it?" Dahlia asked, not looking up from her phone at first, and then looking up, and then looking around slowly, the way you look at something you're trying to find a kind way to describe and failing. The whole thing, I said. "It's efficient. It's a shoebox," my father muttered, not unkindly but not kindly either. The muttering of a man stating a fact he assumed everyone already agreed with. I want to tell you, I didn't feel it land. I did. I felt it land exactly where it was aimed, a small precise wound just beneath the ribs, because there is a particular kind of pain that comes from people who knew you before you had any armor, aiming without even meaning to aim, because to them it isn't aiming. It's just noticing. It's just Sunday conversation. My mother moved further in, touching the edge of the drafting table like she was inspecting a rental property she was deciding whether to walk away from. "Marlo," she said, and there was that voice again, the narrating one, the one that performed concern as though concern were the same thing as love. "You had a corner office. You had that lovely place with the balcony. What happened?" "I chose this," I said. "Nobody chooses this," Dahlia said, laughing a little, not cruelly, just carelessly, the way you laugh at something absurd without registering that the absurd thing is a person's entire life standing in front of you. "You chose this because you had to. There's a difference, March." I didn't argue. I want you to understand that about me before this story goes any further. I have never been a woman who argues in the moment. I absorb. I file things away. I've spent my whole life being the quiet one, the observant one, the one who watches a room instead of commanding it, and there is a particular strength in that which people mistake for weakness because it doesn't announce itself. My father wandered to the window, looked out at the alley, said nothing, which from him was its own small mercy. "Well," my mother said, sitting gingerly on the edge of my single armchair as though the apartment itself might collapse under the weight of a normal Sunday, "we just worry. That's all this is. We worry that you gave up something real for." She gestured at the room, at all 400 square feet of it, at the flowers, at the drafting table, at the life I had built with my own 2 hands. "For this." "For this," Dahlia repeated, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, which somehow made it worse. Gentle mockery is the kind that convinces itself its kindness. We ate brunch on paper plates balanced on our knees because there wasn't a table large enough for 4. Nobody mentioned the flowers. Nobody asked what the drafting table was for, though it was covered in drawings, elevations, floor plans, a whole small city of graphite lines that any one of them could have glanced at and asked about. Nobody asked. They left a little after 2. My mother hugged me at the door with the particular carefulness people use when they think you might be fragile, and said, "We love you no matter what, sweetheart," in a tone that made no matter what sound like a diagnosis. I closed the door. I stood in the middle of my 400 square feet, in the quiet, in the good light coming through the one window, and I did not cry.
I want to be honest about that too.
I felt something colder and clearer than sadness. I felt the particular stillness of a woman deciding, once and for all, that she was done explaining herself to people who had already decided not to understand. I went to the drafting table. I looked down at the drawings they hadn't asked about. The ones I'd been working on for 14 months, the ones with my name in the corner of every sheet, the ones that were, in 9 days, going to be unveiled to the public under a name and a title none of them knew I carried. I picked up my pencil. I kept working. To understand what happened 7 days later, you have to understand what I never told them and why. I had not lied to my family. I want that distinction to matter, because for a long time I sat with the guilt of omission as though it were the same as deception, and eventually I understood that it wasn't. I simply hadn't corrected the story they'd written about me, because the story they'd written was easier for them, and for 3 years I had been too tired to fight for a harder, truer one. Here is the truer one. 5 years ago, I left the corner office my mother still mentioned with a kind of wistfulness, as though I'd abandoned a husband instead of a job title. I left because the firm I worked for built glass towers for people who already had everything, and somewhere in my late 20s I had developed an allergy to that particular kind of emptiness, the emptiness of drafting beautiful rooms that would only ever be lived in by wealth, never by need. I took a pay cut that made my father wince when I mentioned it once before I stopped mentioning things. I went to work for a small design collective that specialized in something unglamorous, adaptive microhousing. Small, dignified spaces for people the housing market had given up on, young people aging out of foster care, elderly tenants displaced by rising rents, families splitting one income 4 ways. 400 square feet, engineered so carefully that every inch did the work of 2. I didn't just design them. I moved into one. Partly for the research. You cannot design dignity into a small space if you've never had to live inside the constraints you're imposing on other people, and partly, if I'm honest, because I liked it. I liked the discipline of it. I liked that nothing in my life was there by accident anymore. The building I lived in, the one my family had climbed 2 flights of stairs into, sniffing faintly at the lack of elevator, was not simply my apartment. It was the pilot project. The first of what would become, if the funding held and the design held and the city council approved the zoning variance we'd spent 2 years fighting for, 11 more buildings across 3 neighborhoods that had been quietly starved of decent housing for a generation. I was the lead designer. My name was on the patents for 3 of the space folding systems built into those walls. The Murphy bed, yes, but also the modular kitchen wall, the fold-flat desk system, 6 separate innovations that had, for months earlier, been quietly nominated for a National Design Award I had not mentioned to a single member of my family because some part of me, the part that still absorbed instead of arguing, had wanted to see if they would ever ask a real question about my life before I volunteered the answer. They never asked. In 9 days, 2 days after that Sunday brunch, the city was holding a public unveiling of the pilot building's full renovation results, along with the announcement of the award nomination, in partnership with the Housing Authority and, as it turned out, covered by 2 local news outlets and 1 national design publication that had been trailing the project for months. My photograph would be in that coverage. My name, spelled correctly this time, would be under a headline instead of under a Sunday brunch table conversation about what I'd given up. I hadn't planned to make a moment out of it. I want that understood clearly because this is not a story about revenge dressed up as coincidence. I had simply been living my actual life, quietly, for years, while my family constructed a smaller, sadder version of it in the space where curiosity should have been. But 7 days after that brunch, my sister came back, unannounced. And she came back on the one afternoon my apartment looked less like a home and more like a war room, because the exhibition materials had arrived a day early, and I hadn't yet packed them away. Dahlia texted from the sidewalk. Passing by, buzz me up, need to borrow that steamer you have. I nearly didn't answer. I was, in that moment, surrounded by proof sheets and floor plans I had spread across every flat surface in the apartment. The drafting table, the small counter, even the floor beside the Murphy bed, folded up to make room. Award nomination letters. A printed advance copy of the magazine feature, my face on page 42 beside a photograph of the very apartment she was about to walk into, captioned with a pull quote about dignity in design that a journalist had pulled from a 2-hour interview I'd given without telling anyone in my family it was happening. I buzzed her up anyway. Some tired, hopeful part of me thought, let her see it by accident. Let this be easier than a confrontation. Let the truth simply exist in the room and do its own quiet work. She came in already talking, the way she always did, phone in one hand, gesturing with the other about a wedding she was helping plan for a friend, 3 steps into my apartment before she stopped talking mid-sentence. I watched her eyes move. That's the part one remember most clearly, not what she said first, but the physical motion of her eyes traveling across the drafting table, down to the magazine spread open beside it, up to the framed nomination letter I'd propped against the window because I hadn't decided yet whether I was proud enough to hang it or embarrassed enough to hide it. "Mar," she said. "Just that." Her voice had lost the sunglasses in the hair carelessness from a week before. "What is this?" "It's my work," I said. Quietly. Not performing it, not selling it to her. Just stating it, the way you'd state your own name. She picked up the magazine before I could stop her, though I didn't try very hard to stop her. She read the caption under the photograph in my apartment, the one she'd called a shoebox 7 days earlier. Twice, I think, because her lips moved slightly the second time. "You designed this building," she said. Not quite a question. "I designed this building. And 10 more like it, if the funding comes through this spring." "The award," she started, holding up the nomination letter now, and I watched something complicated cross her face. Something that wasn't quite guilt, and wasn't quite pride, and wasn't quite the careless laughter from the week before. It looked, more than anything, like recalculation. Like a woman doing fast, silent math on everything she'd said out loud in this exact room 7 days earlier. "You never said anything," she said. "You never asked anything," I said back, and I want to be clear that I said it gently. I had spent a week deciding how I would say it, if I ever got the chance, and I had decided gentleness was the only version of this truth I actually wanted to live inside. Not "how dare you," not "look what you missed," just "you never asked." She sat down slowly on the edge of my single armchair, the same spot my mother had perched on the week before, appraising my life like a property she was deciding whether to condemn, and she was quiet for longer than I had ever known my sister to be quiet. "Mom needs to see this," she said finally. Not to me. Almost to herself. She was already reaching for her phone, and then she stopped and looked up at me instead, and something in her face had gone soft in a way I hadn't seen since we were girls, before either of us had learned to perform certainty at each other across a family that rewarded it. "Mom needs to see this herself," she said again, quieter. "Not for me telling her. She needs to stand in this room and see it herself." I want to pause the story here, because there's a document I have to tell you about, one Dahlia didn't see that day, one I'd written 8 months earlier and never sent to anyone. It was a letter to my mother. I drafted it on a night when the isolation of the work had gotten to me. The long hours, the zoning hearings that went nowhere, the funding meetings where men twice my age asked if I was sure I was qualified to lead a project this size, as if competence required a particular volume of voice I had simply never possessed. In the letter I had tried, for 4 handwritten pages, to explain what I'd never explained out loud, that leaving the corner office wasn't collapse, it was clarity. That the balcony apartment I'd given up had a beautiful view of a city I felt no responsibility toward. That somewhere in my late 20s, ambition had stopped meaning more for me and started meaning purposeful, and I didn't know how to make my mother understand a definition of success that didn't have a corresponding square footage. I had written near the end, "I am not shrinking, Mom. I am precise." There's a difference between a woman who is less because she couldn't get more, and a woman who chose less because she finally understood what more was costing her. I never sent it. I told myself it was because letters felt theatrical, because I preferred to let my life simply speak for itself over time. The truer reason, the one I only admitted to myself much later, was that I was afraid that if I explained myself and she still didn't understand, if I handed her the clearest version of my truth and watched her set it down unread anyway, I would have no story left to tell myself about why I kept trying. So instead of sending the letter, I had simply kept building.
Kept designing.
Kept quietly nudging my life toward a moment where the truth wouldn't need my voice to carry it, because it would be sitting in plain sight, on page 42, under my own name. I didn't know, when Dahlia left that afternoon with her steamer forgotten entirely on the counter, that the letter and the moment were about to collide. My mother called that evening. I almost didn't answer, some old instinct, the same one that had let 7 Sundays go by without correction, telling me to let this settle before I engaged with it. But something in me, the something that had spent a week quietly deciding it was done shrinking to fit other people's understanding, picked up the phone. "Dahlia says she came by today," my mother said. Her voice had none of its usual narrating quality. It sounded, for the first time in longer than I could remember, unrehearsed. "She did," I said. She said. My mother stopped. Started again. "She said there's a magazine. An award. She said you designed the building we were standing in last week." I did. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that in my family usually got filled quickly with performance, with the next line of the script, and this time it didn't. I let it sit. I had learned, over a long, slow career of being underestimated by rooms full of men who assumed competence needed volume, that silence was not something to fear. Silence was where truth got room to breathe. "Can I come see it?" my mother said finally. "Not the unveiling, not the ceremony. Can I come see the apartment? Just the apartment. Just me." She came alone 2 days later, without my father, without Dahlia, on a weekday afternoon when the light came through my one window at the low honeyed angle I'd designed the whole east wall around. She stood in the doorway the way she had the week before, 3 feet in, because 3 feet in was most of the way across the room, but this time she didn't say, "Oh." This time she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the drafting table, at the framed nomination letter I had, in the end, decided to hang after all, at the small square of afternoon light lying across the floor exactly where I'd calculated it would fall when I first drew these walls 14 months earlier. "I called it a shoebox," she said. "Not to me exactly. To the room. To the version of herself who'd said it." "You did." "I stood right here," she said, "and I told you nobody chooses this." "You didn't say that. Dahlia did. You said we worry. That's all this is." My mother closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them there was something in her face I had waited 27 years to see, something that wasn't performance and wasn't narration, something that looked almost like the beginning of a woman seeing her daughter for the first time as a whole person instead of a story she'd already decided how to tell. "Show me," she said. "Not the magazine. Not the award. Show me what you actually built. Explain it to me like I don't already know what I think." So I did. I walked her through it the way I would have walked through it with a stranger, an inspector, a journalist. Except this time I let myself want her to understand, instead of protecting myself in advance from the possibility that she wouldn't. I showed her the fold-flat desk system, the modular kitchen wall, the Murphy bed engineered so the whole structure could rotate for wheelchair access, a detail I'd fought an entire committee to keep in the final design. I showed her the drawings for the next 10 buildings. I told her about the elderly tenant in the 3rd-floor unit who had cried, quietly, the first time she opened a kitchen drawer that reached her without her needing to stand. My mother listened the whole way through without narrating it back to me, without turning it into a story about worry. At the end she sat down on the edge of the armchair, the same spot, and put her face in her hands for a moment, and when she looked up her eyes were wet. "I need to see this myself," she said, echoing, without knowing she was echoing, the exact words Dahlia had said in this room 7 days before. Not told to me, not summarized. "I needed to stand here and see it myself because I think I've been looking at you my whole life the same way, hearing about you secondhand, through my own worry, instead of standing still long enough to actually see. I want to be honest about what I did not do in the weeks that followed, because I think it matters as much as what I did. I did not bring up the shoebox comment again. I did not read them the letter I'd written 8 months earlier and never sent, I burned it actually the week after my mother's visit, not out of anger, but because it had done its work simply by existing long enough for me to understand my own reasons, and it no longer needed to exist as evidence. I did not attend the awards ceremony with my chin lifted in triumph, waiting for my family to see me photographed and finally regret every Sunday comment. I attended it exactly as I would have if none of them had ever visited that apartment at all. Quietly, in a gray dress I'd bought for the occasion, standing at the back of the room until they called my name, because the work had never been about being seen. It had been about being precise. My father came to the ceremony. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but he stood at the edge of the crowd afterward while people I didn't know shook my hand and asked about the funding timeline for the next 11 buildings, and when the crowd thinned he came over and looked at me for a long moment. I called it a shoebox too, he said. I didn't correct her. That's on me. It's all right, I said, and I meant it, because by then something in me had already settled into a kind of peace that didn't require an apology to complete itself. The peace had come earlier. In the quiet stillness of the afternoon, my mother stood in my doorway and asked to be shown instead of told. Dahlia texted me a week later. Asterisk, found your steamer still at your place, by the way. Also, can I take you to lunch? I want to actually ask you things this time. Asterisk, we went to lunch. She asked me things. Real ones. What the zoning fight had actually involved. Whether I was scared, starting something this big with my name on every drawing. Whether I missed the balcony. I told her the truth on that last one. That I didn't, not really, because the balcony had overlooked a view that belonged to no one, and the 400 square feet I lived in now overlooked 11 buildings worth of lives I'd had a hand in making more livable. I did write a letter in the end. Not the one I'd burned. A new one, shorter, sent the week after the ceremony, to all three of them at once, my mother, my father, Dahlia, because I had learned something in that strange, quiet stretch of 7 days that I wanted to say plainly once, instead of letting it live only in the architecture of my choices. I'm not writing this to correct you, it began. Asterisk, I'm writing it because I spent a long time believing that if I just kept building quietly, the truth would eventually explain itself, and I wouldn't have to risk being misunderstood out loud. I think that was its own kind of smallness, not the apartment, the silence. Asterisk. Asterisk, I chose 400 square feet on purpose. I chose it the way you choose a discipline, not the way you choose a sentence. Every fold in every wall in that apartment exists because I decided a long time ago that dignity doesn't require space, it requires intention. I wanted to prove that to strangers before I ever tried to prove it to you, and I think that says something true and a little sad about how safe I felt, historically, being understood by my own family. Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't need an apology for the Sunday you called it a shoebox. I need us, going forward, to ask each other real questions before we write each other's stories for us. That's the only justice I actually want. Not to be right, just to be asked. Asterisk. My mother called, crying 20 minutes after I sent it. Not performing grief this time, just crying, plainly, the way people cry when something true finally lands somewhere it can be felt instead of narrated. I don't know how to ask better questions, she admitted. I never learned how. My own mother never asked me anything either. She just decided things about me, and I lived inside her decisions for 40 years before I even noticed the walls. It was the first time my mother had ever told me anything true about her own mother. It was, I think, the beginning of a different kind of conversation between us. One built, like my walls, out of small folded systems that did more work than their size suggested. It's been 4 months now. The pilot building has become a template. 3 more are under construction in a neighborhood 20 minutes from the first, funded in part by a grant that came through 2 weeks after the award ceremony, the extra visibility apparently having mattered in ways I hadn't calculated for and wouldn't have chosen for myself, but didn't refuse either. My mother visits more now. She sits in the same armchair, but she doesn't perch on the edge of it anymore, appraising. She asks questions, real ones, sometimes clumsy ones, the questions of someone learning a language late in life and stumbling over the grammar of curiosity. What does the funding committee actually look at? What happens if the zoning appeal fails? Does the wheelchair-accessible unit cost more to build? And if it does, where does that money come from? I answer all of it.
Patiently.
Not because I owe her patience, but because I've decided patience is the version of strength I actually want to practice, and there's a particular satisfaction in offering someone the exact thing they once failed to offer you. Dahlia comes by sometimes too. Steamer forgotten again on the counter, though now it feels less like an excuse and more like a running joke between us, a small, ordinary intimacy we're rebuilding slowly, one honest lunch at a time. I still live in the 400 square feet. I could afford more now if I wanted it. The award came with a modest stipend, and the design consulting has picked up since the coverage, but I don't want it, and for the first time in my life I don't feel the need to explain that choice to anyone standing in my doorway. Some evenings I sit at the drafting table in the last honeyed light before dark, working on the drawings for building number 4, and I think about the particular kind of quiet that comes after a truth has finally been seen instead of summarized. It isn't triumph. It isn't the loud, cinematic satisfaction of being proven right in front of the people who doubted you. It's smaller than that and steadier. It's the quiet of a woman who spent years being underestimated by the people who loved her and who discovered, in the end, that the only justice worth having was never punishment. It was simply this: being asked at last to explain herself and being believed this time when she did. My name is Marlo Ashcombe. I was 27 when my family called my life a failure standing in a doorway. I am 28 now, and for the first time when they stand in that same doorway, they actually look around the room before they decide what they see.